The sky above Manhattan tore open like infected flesh, and what came through was not an army, but a hunger older than Earth itself. The portal did not glow blue and clean like Stark's theories predicted. It pulsed wet and organic, ringed with chitinous growths that sprouted and died and regrew in seconds, and the smell hit first, a wave of rot and acid and something worse, something that made people's stomachs clench with an instinct they didn't know they had. Then the first creatures came through, not flying chariots or armored soldiers, but living missiles, each the size of a city bus, with too many limbs and faces that were just holes lined with teeth. They didn't roar. They screamed in voices that sounded like children and animals and grinding metal all at once. And when they hit the streets, they didn't explode. They kept moving, tearing through cars and concrete, with claws that looked like they were grown specifically to cut through everything humanity had ever built. Behind them came smaller things, thousands of them scuttling on 6 legs or 8 or 10, and they moved wrong, too fast and too coordinated, like they were all parts of one massive organism that had decided Manhattan was food. People ran. The Avengers assembled on the street, weapons ready, and Steve Rogers raised his shield and shouted orders that sounded confident, but even he felt it, that ancient animal part of his brain that had kept his ancestors alive in caves, and it was screaming at him that this was not a fight, this was a hunt, and humanity was the prey. And standing at the top of Stark Tower, watching through the window with eyes that reflected something between triumph and horror, Loki looked down at what he had agreed to bring to Earth. And for the first time since making his bargain in the cold void between stars, he wondered if even gods could make mistakes too large to survive. Tony Stark was the first to get real data, and he wished he hadn't. The suit's sensors went haywire the moment those things came through the portal, readings spiking into ranges that made Jarvis pause for a full 2 seconds before reporting, which in computer time meant the AI had needed to completely recalibrate what it thought was possible. "Sir, the biological signatures are off scale," Jarvis said, calm as ever, which somehow made it worse. "Each organism exhibits a neural connection to every other organism in range. They are not individual creatures. They are a single distributed intelligence operating through multiple bodies." Tony shot 3 repulsor blasts into the nearest creature, the bus-sized one with the screaming faces, and watched the beams burn clean through its carapace. It died, fluid spraying across the street, but it didn't slow down until the last second, and even as it collapsed, 2 smaller ones were already eating it, absorbing its mass, growing larger. "Okay," Tony said. "That's new. That's very extremely new." Steve hit the ground running, shield up, and the first wave of smaller creatures hit him like a tsunami of claws and teeth. His shield took the impact, sent 3 of them flying, but there were dozens more, and they learned. The second wave came lower, trying to flank, and the third wave was already adapting to his timing. He could see it happening in real time. These things were not just animals. They were smart. Not intelligent like people, but smart like a computer, running a program designed by something that understood war better than any general Steve had ever served under. He drove his shield into the ground and used it as leverage to kick 2 creatures into a wall. And when he pulled the shield free, there was acid burning into the metal, eating at the paint. "We need containment," he shouted into the comm. "They're adaptive hostiles. Repeat, adaptive hostiles." Natasha was on a rooftop with Clint, both of them putting arrows and bullets into the swarm, and she watched one of her shots hit a creature center mass and blow it apart, acid blood spraying everywhere. The blood hit a car and melted through the hood in seconds. It hit the street and started eating the asphalt. She looked at Clint. He looked at her. "We're gonna need bigger guns," he said. She nodded and reloaded, but her hands were steady because if there was one thing SHIELD training had taught her, it was how to keep moving when your brain was screaming. Below them, the creatures were spreading out in patterns that looked random but weren't. Classic swarm dispersal tactics, the kind you saw in ants and bees, but scaled up and faster and directed by something that understood human cities like a predator understands a herd. Bruce Banner was still 3 blocks away when he saw the footage on a broken TV in a storefront window. The creatures were eating people, not killing them. Eating them. He felt the Hulk rising, that green edge of rage, but this time it was mixed with something else, something cold and sick, because Bruce had a PhD in biology, and he knew what he was looking at. These were not aliens using technology. These were biological weapons that had actually evolved to consume and adapt and spread, and whatever had made them had been doing it for a very long time. He stopped trying to hold the Hulk back. Sometimes the monster was the right tool. He let go, felt his body explode outward, and the Hulk roared and charged toward the sound of screaming, because even the Hulk understood what needed to die. Thor came down from the sky like a thunderbolt, Mjolnir leading, and he crashed into the largest creature he could see, the one that was 30 feet tall and covered in bone plates, and had a mouth that split open in 4 directions. The hammer hit it with enough force to crack a building foundation, and the creature staggered, screamed, and then lunged at him with speed that shocked even a god. Thor barely got his hammer up in time, and the impact drove him back 10 feet, boots tearing furrows in the asphalt. He grinned because finally a real fight, but then he saw its eyes, not rage, not hate, just hunger. This thing did not want to conquer. It wanted to eat everything, and behind it, through the portal, he could see more coming, hundreds more, thousands more, a tide of living weapons that stretched back into darkness. His grin faded. "Avengers," he said into the comm, voice tight. "We may require more than bravery this day." Loki watched from Stark Tower and felt the weight of his choices like a physical thing pressing on his chest. He had made the deal 3 months ago, after falling from the Bifrost, after tumbling through the void and the cold and the madness of the spaces between worlds. He had been found by something, not Thanos. Thanos had come later, after, but first there had been the voice, the hive mind, the thing that was hunger given sentence. And it had offered him an army, not soldiers, an army that could not be stopped, could not be reasoned with, could not be turned. All he had to do was open the door. He had thought he understood. He had thought he could control it, use it, prove himself to Asgard and his father and Thor and everyone who had ever looked at him like he was lesser. But now, watching those things pour through the portal, watching them spread across the city like a living infection, he realized he had not summoned an army. He had opened a door to something that made Asgard's wars look like children playing with wooden swords. The scepter in his hand pulsed, blue light flickering, and he felt the Mind Stone's influence pressing on his thoughts. But underneath that, he felt something else, something vast and cold and patient, and it was watching through his eyes, learning about this new world, cataloging its defenses, calculating how long it would take to strip this planet down to bedrock. He had made a terrible mistake. On the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier, Nick Fury watched the satellite feeds and felt his blood turn to ice. He'd seen a lot in his career, Kree, Skrull, enhanced individuals who could level city blocks. But this was different. The creatures were spreading in a pattern that S.H.I.E.L.D.'s tactical computers recognized immediately as biological warfare dispersal, exponential growth model, self-sustaining and self-replicating. Except biological warfare didn't usually walk on 10 legs and eat through steel. "Get me everything we have on extraterrestrial biological threats," he said. Maria Hill was already typing. "Sir, there's nothing in the database that matches this profile. Closest comparison is theoretical xenomorph scenarios from the Wayland files, but those are science fiction." Fury kept watching the screen. A creature had just grabbed a police car and bit through it like an apple, then started eating the metal. "Not anymore," he said. "Get me containment options, orbital strike packages, biological warfare protocols, and somebody find me an expert in anything that looks like that." Down in the streets, a young S.H.I.E.L.D. agent named McKinley was crouched behind an overturned truck, trying to reload his sidearm with shaking hands. He'd been on duty at the New York office when the call came in, some kind of attack, all hands on deck, and he'd grabbed his gun and his vest and run toward the sound of chaos, because that's what the job was. Now he was watching things that shouldn't exist tear through a National Guard checkpoint like it was made of paper, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking, and he'd lost his radio somewhere, and all he could think about was how this morning he'd complained about the coffee in the break room being too weak. He'd give anything for weak coffee right now. He'd give anything to be bored. A creature skittered past his hiding spot, close enough to touch, and he held his breath and pressed himself against the truck and prayed to a god he wasn't sure he believed in. The creature paused, its head swiveled towards him, eyeless, just a mass of sensory organs that rippled like water. It knew he was there. McKinley raised his gun, hand shaking so hard he could barely aim, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet punched through the creature's head, and it collapsed, twitched, went still. McKinley let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Then 10 more creatures rounded the corner and saw him and charged. Captain America hit the group at a dead sprint, shield leading, and scattered them like bowling pins. He grabbed McKinley by the vest and hauled him up. "Can you run?" McKinley nodded, couldn't speak. "Then run that way, don't stop." McKinley ran. Steve turned back to the creatures and started fighting again, because that's what soldiers did. They held the line so other people could escape. And he'd been doing it since 1943, and he wasn't about to stop now. But even as he fought, even as his shield rang like a bell with each impact, he was doing the math in his head. 10 creatures here, 20 down the block, hundreds in the streets, thousands coming through the portal, and the Avengers were 6 people. Good people, strong people, but 6. The math didn't work. They needed help. They needed a plan. They needed something more than fists and shields and lightning. A creature leaped at him from the left, claws extended, and Steve pivoted and threw his shield and caught it mid-air, and the shield bounced back to his hand like it always did, and the creature fell dead, and he was already moving to the next target, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant letting the people behind him die, and that was not acceptable. Hulk was having the time of his life until he wasn't. At first it was simple. Sea creature, smash creature. Creature dies. Good. But then Hulk smashed one and it exploded into acid and the acid burned and Hulk roared in pain and anger and smashed 3 more and they all exploded and suddenly Hulk was covered in acid and it hurt, actually hurt, and that made Hulk angry, but also made Hulk cautious because Hulk was not stupid. Hulk was smart in ways Banner wouldn't admit, so Hulk started throwing things instead. Cars, trucks, pieces of buildings. And that worked better until the creatures started dodging, learning, adapting to his timing. They were watching him. They were learning from him. That made Hulk pause. Things that learned were harder to smash. Hulk didn't like that. Thor called lightning from the sky and burned a dozen creatures to ash, and for a moment he thought they were winning. Then he saw the ash moving. The ash was reforming, pulling itself back together, and the creatures that regrew were smaller but faster, and they came at him in a coordinated strike that forced him into the air. He flew higher, looked down at the city, and saw the scope of what they faced. The portal was widening, the creatures were spreading in every direction, buildings were being consumed, not destroyed but consumed, organic matter spreading across steel and concrete like mold. And in the distance, through the portal, he saw something massive moving. Something so large it made the 30-foot creatures look like insects, and he knew with cold certainty that if that thing came through, there would be no stopping it. "Loki!" he roared. "Close the portal!" And Loki did not answer. Natasha and Clint were running low on ammunition, which was bad, but they were still alive, which was good. They'd fallen back to a defensible position on a rooftop, using the high ground to pick off targets. But the creatures were climbing now, using each other as ladders, and it was only a matter of time before they were overrun. "We need an exit strategy," Natasha said. Clint fired his last explosive arrow into a cluster of creatures below, and it bought them maybe 30 seconds. "I'm open to suggestions." Natasha looked at the streets below, at the tide of alien flesh spreading like a living carpet, and made a decision. "We go down fighting, or we find whoever's controlling this and put an arrow in their eye." Clint grinned. It wasn't a happy grin. "I like option 2. Tony was flying pattern 8s over the city, trying to keep the creatures contained to a 6-block radius. But it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a rake. Every time he burned one, 3 more appeared. Every time he thought he had them contained, they found a new way to spread. And his suit was taking damage. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the acid was eating at the repulsor housings, and he had maybe 20% power left, and Jarvis was giving him warnings about structural integrity that he was actively ignoring. "Cap, we need a plan," he said into the comm. "I'm open to ideas." Steve's voice came back, breathless, mid-fight. Working on it, Thor. Can you close the portal? Thor's voice strained. The scepter controls it. We need Loki. Tony's voice flat. Great. Everybody's favorite war criminal. I'll go have a chat. Loki was still standing at the window when Tony crashed through it, repulsors charged, faceplate up so Loki could see the rage in his eyes. Close it, Tony said. Now. No, Loki turned slowly, and Tony saw something in his face that made him pause. Not defiance, not arrogance, fear, real fear. I cannot, Loki said, and his voice was quiet. It is beyond my control now. Tony took a step forward. Explain, fast. Loki gestured to the portal, to the creatures pouring through. I made a bargain, an army in exchange for Earth, but the army is not an army, it is a hive, a Tyranid hive fleet, and I did not summon it, I merely opened the door. It does not serve me, I serve as its doorway. He looked at Tony, and for the first time since they'd met, Tony saw something honest in Loki's eyes. We are all going to die. Your world, my world, all worlds. That is what the hive does. It eats, it adapts, it spreads, and it cannot be stopped. Tony stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and flew back out the window without another word. Because if Loki was telling the truth, they had a much bigger problem than a god with daddy issues. Jarvis, get me everything you can find on anything called Tyranid. Any database, any file, anywhere. Jarvis was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Sir, there is no data available on that term in any accessible human database. Tony's jaw tightened. Then we're figuring this out the hard way. On the helicarrier, Fury's phone rang. It was a secure line, the kind that only a few people in the world had access to, and when he answered, the voice on the other end was calm and British and entirely too composed for the situation. Director Fury, this is Brigadier Alistair Gordon Lethbridge Stewart, Unit Liaison. We've been monitoring the New York situation. You have a biological invasion scenario. We can help, but you need to listen very carefully and do exactly what I say. Fury didn't question it. He didn't have time. Talk. The Brigadier's voice was crisp. What you're facing is extraterrestrial biological warfare at its most extreme. The creatures are not individual entities. They are appendages of a larger organism, a hive mind. Killing them individually is useless. They will adapt. They will consume their own dead. They will learn from every attack. Your only option is to cut off the source. Close the portal immediately. If you don't, if even one of those creatures escapes containment and reaches open wilderness, your planet has approximately 6 months before the infestation becomes irreversible. Fury felt his stomach drop. 6 months. The Brigadier's voice didn't waver. If you're lucky, the hive consumes biomass exponentially. It will start with animal life, then plant life, then the oceans. Then it will strip the atmosphere. You will have famines within weeks, ecosystem collapse within months, total planetary consumption within a year. This is not an invasion. This is extermination. Fury looked at the screens, at the creatures spreading across Manhattan, and made a decision. What do you need from me? The Brigadier told him. Steve was on his 4th wave of creatures when his comm crackled and Fury's voice came through tight and controlled. Captain, we have intel. The creatures are part of a hive organism. Killing them individually won't stop the spread. We need to close the portal, whatever it takes. Steve ducked under a claw swipe and drove his shield into a creature's throat. Working on it, Stark's trying to get to Loki. Fury's voice came back harder. Then work faster. We've got maybe an hour before these things spread beyond Manhattan. If they reach the Hudson, if they get into the water supply, we lose the eastern seaboard. If they reach the forests upstate, we lose containment. This isn't about winning, Captain. This is about survival. Steve felt the weight of that settle on his shoulders. He'd fought Hydra, he'd fought Nazis, he'd fought a lot of things, but those were enemies with tactics, with limits, with goals you could understand. This was different. This was nature, weaponized and pointed at humanity like a loaded gun. Avengers, he said into the comm. We've got new priority. Contain these things to Manhattan. Nothing gets past the bridges. Nothing gets to the water. Whatever it takes. Tony's voice came back. Cap, my suit's at 15%. I can hold maybe another 10 minutes, Thor's voice. I am wounded. The creature's acid burns even as guardian flesh. Natasha's voice calm as ever. We're almost out of ammunition. Steve took a breath. Then we bide time the old-fashioned way. We hold the line. Hulk didn't understand tactics, but Hulk understood protect. Hulk understood stop. So when the little creatures tried to run past Hulk toward the bridge where people were running away, Hulk said no. Hulk picked up a bus and threw it sideways and blocked the road, and when creatures tried to climb over, Hulk smashed them. Acid or no acid, pain or no pain, because that's what Hulk did. Hulk protected, even when it hurt. Back at S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters, a scientist named Dr. Chen was pulling up every file they had on biological threats. And her hands were shaking because she'd spent her entire career studying theoretical scenarios, and now one was happening outside her window. She found a file buried in old sword records, something about biological nightmares from beyond known space, theoretical species that evolved not on planets but in the void between stars, and the file had a name, Tyranid. She read the file, then she read it again. Then she picked up the phone and called Fury directly, bypassing 3 levels of security, because this was too important. "Sir, I found something. It's bad. It's really, really bad." Fury listened to her for exactly 2 minutes, and with every word his expression got harder. When she finished, he was silent for 5 seconds. Then he said, "Thank you, Doctor," and hung up and turned to Hill. "Get me the World Security Council, now, and prep the nuclear option." Hill's eyes went wide. "Sir, that's Manhattan. Millions of civilians." Fury's voice was flat. "I know, but if Dr. Chen is right, if these things are what she thinks they are, then millions is better than billions. We might have to make a choice." Hill didn't argue. She started making calls. Tony landed on Stark Tower again, repulsors flickering, suit warning lights turning his HUD into a Christmas tree of bad news. Loki was still there, standing exactly where Tony had left him, and he hadn't moved. "Tell me how to close it," Tony said. Loki laughed, and it was not a sane sound. "The scepter. Use the scepter. But you will need to reach the portal device on the roof, and the Hive will not let you. They know now. They know you want to close the door. And they are learning how you fight. They are adapting. By the time you reach the roof, they will have evolved countermeasures specifically for you." Tony looked at him. "You're really not helping your case for not getting punched right now?" Loki met his eyes. "I am trying to save both our lives, Stark. Because if Earth falls, if the Hive takes this world, they will use the Bifrost as a gateway. They will spread to Asgard, to all the 9 realms, and even gods can be eaten." Tony processed that, then he activated his comm. "Team, I've got a plan. It's a bad plan, but it's a plan. We need to get the scepter to the portal device on top of Stark Tower. That should close it. Problem is, our scaly friends up there are going to fight us every step of the way. And apparently they're learning our moves, which is just fantastic. So we hit them with everything we've got all at once, overwhelming force, and we don't stop until that portal is closed or we're all dead? Questions?" Silence. Then Steve's voice, calm and steady. "No questions. Let's get it done." The assault on Stark Tower began with thunder and ended with screaming. Thor came in first, Mjolnir spinning so fast it was just a blur of silver light, and he called down lightning that turned the sky white and burned through 50 creatures in a single blast. The smell of cooked alien flesh filled the air, thick and wrong, like burnt plastic mixed with rotting meat. Steve was right behind him, shield raised, and he hit the stairs at a run, because the elevator was a death trap. Tony flew straight up the outside of the building, dodging creatures that launched themselves from windows like living missiles, and his targeting system was screaming warnings because there were too many targets, too many threats, too many angles of attack. Natasha and Clint came in through a side entrance, moving fast and quiet, weapons ready, and they could hear the creatures inside the building clicking and hissing and making sounds that almost sounded like words but weren't. Just mimicry, the Hive learning human sounds the way a parrot learns speech, empty of meaning but full of threat. Hulk didn't bother with doors. Hulk went through the wall on the 3rd floor and started climbing up through the building itself, smashing through ceilings and floors, and behind him the structure groaned but held because Stark had built it to withstand attacks, and apparently that included the Hulk, using it as a ladder. The creatures inside tried to stop him. That was their first mistake. Hulk grabbed one, used it as a club to smash 3 more, then threw the corpse through a window. The creatures didn't retreat. They didn't know how. They just kept coming wave after wave, and Hulk kept smashing, but even he was slowing down now. Even his regeneration couldn't keep up with the acid burns covering his arms and chest, and green blood mixed with alien ichor on the floor. Steve hit the 25th floor and found it completely covered in organic matter. The walls were gone, replaced by chitinous growth that pulsed like a heartbeat. The floor was soft under his boots, spongy, and it made wet sounds when he stepped on it. The creatures had been here for maybe 20 minutes, and they'd already started converting the building into part of themselves. He'd seen Nazi experiments in the war, terrible things, but this was worse because it wasn't cruel. It was just efficient, just nature doing what nature does, consuming and growing and spreading. A creature dropped from the ceiling, and Steve's shield was up before his brain registered the movement, pure combat instinct, and the impact nearly drove him to his knees. The creature was heavier than before, denser, and when it pulled back, Steve saw that its claws had changed, grown longer and sharper, and there were bone ridges along its arms that looked designed to catch and deflect shield strikes. It had adapted. In 20 minutes, it had adapted specifically to fight him. Steve felt a cold weight in his stomach, but he didn't stop moving. He drove forward, used his momentum, caught the creature under the jaw with the shield edge, and snapped its neck. It fell. 2 more dropped from above. Tony reached the roof and immediately took fire from 10 directions at once. Not gunfire, biological fire. The creatures had ranged attackers now, things that looked like crosses between scorpions and artillery pieces, and they were launching bone spikes the size of javelins at velocities that punched through steel. One spike hit his left arm and shattered the repulsor housing completely. Red warnings flooded his HUD. "Jarvis, how long until total system failure?" Jarvis's voice was calm as always. "At current damage rate, approximately 4 minutes, sir." Tony landed, switched to hand-to-hand combat mode, and started fighting his way toward the portal device. It was 20 feet away. It might as well have been 20 miles. Thor reached the top of the stairwell and found Loki standing there, scepter in hand, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Brothers separated by choices and lies and 1,000 years of complicated history. "Brother," Thor said, "help us end this." Loki's face was unreadable. I cannot. The hive will not release its hold. The moment I try to use the scepter against it, it will kill me through the neural link." Thor stepped closer, Mjolnir lowered but ready. "Then you die as a hero instead of a villain? That is a choice, Loki. Perhaps the only real choice you have left." Loki laughed, bitter and broken. "You still do not understand, Thor. I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of failing again, of being forgotten, of being nothing." Thor's voice softened. "Then be something, here, now, when it matters." Natasha and Clint reached the exterior observation deck and immediately dove for cover as a wave of flying creatures swept past, close enough to feel the wind from their wings. Clint's last arrow was clutched in his hand like a talisman. 1 arrow, 1 shot. He looked at Natasha. "If I miss—" She cut him off. "You won't miss," he smiled, tired and real. "Glad one of us is confident." He stood, drew, tracked the largest creature he could see, the one that looked like it was coordinating the others, leading them, maybe some kind of synaptic node in the hive network. He took a breath, let it out halfway, fired. The arrow flew straight and true, and Clint had been shooting since he was 6 years old, and he'd never missed when it counted, and he didn't miss now. The arrow punched through the creature's skull, and it dropped like a puppet with cut strings. For exactly 3 seconds the other creatures paused, confused, their network disrupted. 3 seconds. Steve used those seconds to reach the roof. Hulk used them to punch through the ceiling and emerge like a green avalanche. Tony used them to reach the portal device and slam his remaining functional hand against the interface. Nothing happened. "Jarvis, why isn't it working?" Tony's voice was tight. Jarvis responded immediately. "Sir, the device has been biologically integrated with the hive structure. It is no longer purely mechanical. It requires the scepter's energy signature to override." Tony looked across the roof to where Thor and Loki were still standing, still talking, and he didn't have time for family drama. "Thor, we need the scepter, now!" Thor turned, nodded, reached for Loki's hand. Loki pulled back. "You do not understand what you are asking. The scepter is linked to the Mind Stone. The stone is linked to the hive. If I sever that connection, the feedback will—" He stopped. smiled. It was a sad smile. Of course, that is the only way. The hive must believe I am still its tool until the final moment. He looked at Thor. Tell father I... He stopped again, shook his head. No, tell him nothing. Let him remember me as he will. Loki walked toward the portal device, and with each step creatures lunged at him. But the scepter pulsed and they fell back, confused, because he was still part of the network, still connected, still theirs. He reached Tony, handed him the scepter. When you activate it, the portal will close, but the hive will attempt to keep it open. It will flood through with everything it has. You will have perhaps 10 seconds before the concentration of biomass collapses the building. I suggest you evacuate. Tony took the scepter. It was cold, colder than metal should be, and he could feel something in it, something vast and angry and intelligent. What about you? Loki's smile was genuine this time. I am exactly where I deserve to be. He turned back toward the portal and spread his arms wide, and his voice rang out clear and strong. Come then, come and face the god of mischief. Let me show you what defiance looks like. The portal erupted. What came through was not creatures, not the mindless drones they'd been fighting, but something else, something massive, a bio-titan the size of a skyscraper with too many limbs and a mouth that could swallow buildings. It saw Loki. It recognized betrayal. It screamed, and the scream shattered windows across 6 blocks, and it lunged. Loki stood his ground. He raised his hands, and illusions bloomed across the rooftop. Copies of himself, hundreds of them, all moving in different directions, and the bio-titan struck at phantoms while the real Loki ran towards it, towards certain death, pulling its attention, keeping it focused on him and not on Tony, who was pressing the scepter against the portal device and praying to whatever gods listen to men in metal suits. The device activated, blue light exploded outward, the portal began to collapse, folding in on itself like reality was healing a wound. The bio-titan felt it, understood. It abandoned Loki and lunged toward Tony, but Thor was there first, Mjolnir swinging, and the hammer hit the creature's head with a thunderclap that echoed across Manhattan. It staggered. Hulk hit it from the other side, a double-fisted blow that would have pulverized a mountain, and the creature fell, crashed through the roof, and kept falling through floor after floor, and the building groaned like a dying animal. Steve grabbed Tony. We need to go, now! Tony didn't argue. They ran for the edge of the roof, and Thor grabbed Loki, who was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and they jumped just as the portal collapsed completely, and the backlash of energy turned the top 15 floors of Stark Tower into a crater of twisted metal and burning debris. They fell. Thor called the wind and slowed their descent. They hit the street hard but alive, and around them the creatures that had been pouring from the portal stopped moving, all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The hive connection was severed. The creatures began to collapse, their bodies breaking down without the hive mind to coordinate them, dissolving into puddles of organic sludge that steamed and bubbled and smelled like death. It was over. They'd won. Manhattan was saved, except Manhattan didn't look saved. It looked like a war zone. Buildings were half consumed by alien biomass. Bodies lay in the streets, human and creature both. Fires burned unchecked. The damage stretched for blocks, and Steve stood there, breathing hard, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, and looked at what they'd done, what they'd barely survived, and thought about what Fury had said. 1 hour. They'd had 1 hour before this spread beyond containment. 1 hour. They'd made it with maybe 5 minutes to spare. Tony's suit finally gave up and powered down completely, locking him inside, and he had to manually trigger the emergency release to get the faceplate open. He gasped for air and looked at Loki, who was lying on the ground, barely conscious, being held by Thor. Is he going to make it? Thor's voice was tight. I do not know. The hive's connection burned through his mind. He may never wake, and if he does, he may not be himself. Tony wanted to feel satisfaction, wanted to feel like justice had been served, but all he felt was tired. Get him medical attention. We'll figure out the rest later. Natasha and Clint found them 10 minutes later, both limping, both alive. No words were needed. They'd all seen combat. They all knew what coming down from an adrenaline high felt like. They stood together and watched the fires burn and waited for SHIELD teams to arrive and tried not to think about how close they'd come to losing everything. Hulk was the last to arrive, walking slowly, covered in burns, and as he walked, he shrank. green fading to pale skin, rage giving way to exhaustion, and Bruce Banner collapsed naked and bleeding onto the asphalt, and immediately curled into a ball because the pain was catching up to him now. Steve took off his torn jacket and covered him. Some things mattered more than modesty. The SHIELD medical teams arrived 30 minutes later, along with containment crews in hazmat suits, who started spraying the alien biomass with something that made it dissolve faster, break down into components that wouldn't contaminate the environment. Fury arrived 20 minutes after that, stepping out of a helicopter that landed right in the middle of the street, and he looked at the Avengers, and then at the devastation around them, and his face gave away nothing. "Good work," he said. "You saved the planet. Get checked out by medical, then we debrief." He started to walk away, then stopped, turned back. "And somebody find me every piece of that alien tissue we can recover. I want it studied. I want to know everything about what we just fought. Because if it came here once, it can come here again." The medical tent was set up 2 blocks away, and the Avengers were processed through like soldiers coming back from deployment, which is what they were, really. Wounds cleaned and bandaged, vitals checked, blood drawn for contamination screening. Bruce got clothes and a blanket and a sedative because he was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. Thor refused medical attention and sat with Loki, who was unconscious and hooked up to machines that beeped steadily. Tony sat alone and stared at his hands and tried not to think about how his suit had failed, how close he'd come to dying, how many times that day he'd made choices that could have gotten people killed. Steve accepted a bandage for the cut on his forehead and then went outside and found a working phone and started calling SHIELD contacts to get casualty numbers. He needed to know, needed to understand the cost. Natasha and Clint found a quiet corner and sat back to back, both of them too wired to sleep but too exhausted to move, and they didn't talk because there was nothing to say that the other didn't already know. The casualty numbers came in slowly. 74 confirmed dead, hundreds injured. Most of the deaths had happened in the first 5 minutes, before the Avengers had established any kind of perimeter, when people were panicking and running and the creatures were at their most aggressive. It could have been worse. It could have been so much worse. Steve read the numbers and felt each one like a physical weight, because that's what command meant, carrying the weight of everyone who died under your watch. Tony read the numbers and immediately started calculating reconstruction costs, because that's how his brain worked, turning grief into logistics. Thor read the numbers and thought about Asgard, about how many people had died in their wars over the centuries, and wondered if humanity would handle this better or worse than his people had. The debriefing happened 6 hours later in a SHIELD mobile command center that smelled like coffee and stress. Fury sat at the head of the table. The Avengers filled the other seats, cleaned up but still looking like they'd been through a meat grinder. "Let's start with the basics," Fury said. "What the hell were those things?" Tony pulled up a holographic display that Jarvis had compiled from suit data. "Best guess? Biological weapons that evolved naturally, if you can call anything that horrifying natural. They operate as a hive mind, single distributed intelligence controlling thousands of bodies. They adapt in real time to threats. They consume biomass and use it to create more of themselves. They're self-replicating, self-sustaining, and they don't stop until they run out of things to eat." He paused. "We got lucky. If Loki hadn't turned on them, if we hadn't closed that portal exactly when we did, we'd be having a very different conversation right now." Fury nodded slowly. Dr. Chen's analysis confirms that. She found records in old sword files, theoretical studies on extragalactic biological threats. There's a name for this species, Tyranid. The files say they've consumed entire galaxies, traveling through the void between stars, following psychic signals to find new food sources. He looked at Loki's image on a medical monitor in the corner. Loki opened a door. Question is, who told him how to open it, and why did they want access to Earth? Steve leaned forward. Does it matter? They're gone. The portal's closed. We need to focus on cleanup and making sure this doesn't happen again. Fury's eye was hard. It matters, Captain, because if someone out there has access to these things, if they can weaponize them, then Earth just moved to the top of a very dangerous list. Thor spoke for the first time since the debriefing started. The Tyranid hive fleets are legend even in Asgard. Ancient stories, Warnings passed down from the time before the 9 realms were united. They are called the Great Devourer, the shadow in the warp, the hunger that walks. We thought them myth, monsters from old tales meant to frighten children. But if they are real, if Loki truly made contact with them, then he has committed a crime beyond measure. He has endangered not just Earth, not just Asgard, but all living things in this region of space. His voice was heavy. My father will demand justice. Loki must answer for this before the throne of Asgard. Tony's voice was flat. He's in a coma. Pretty sure he's already been judged. Thor met his eyes. If he wakes, Stark, when he wakes, he will face Asgardian law. That is not negotiable. The room went quiet. Finally, Fury spoke. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Right now we have more immediate problems. The alien biomass is breaking down, but we don't know if it's safe. We need to quarantine 6 city blocks. We need to evacuate anyone who came in contact with the creatures for medical observation. We need to spin this for the media without causing a global panic. And we need to figure out how to explain to the president that Manhattan was almost eaten by space bugs. He looked around the table. You're all heroes. You saved the world. But the work isn't done. Get some rest. You got 8 hours. Then we start cleanup. The Avengers filed out, exhausted, and went their separate ways to process what had happened. Steve found a quiet rooftop and watched the sun come up over the damaged city and thought about all the people who hadn't made it, who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he made the same promise he always made after battles, that he'd remember them, that their deaths would mean something. Tony went back to what was left of his tower and stared at the ruins and started making plans to rebuild, because that's what you did. You rebuilt, you kept going, even when it felt impossible. Bruce found a shield safe house and slept for 14 hours straight and dreamed of green rage and acid burns and woke up screaming. Natasha and Clint found a diner that had somehow survived untouched, and they ordered coffee and pie and sat in a booth and didn't talk about the battle, just sat there existing in each other's presence because sometimes that was enough. Thor stayed with Loki in the medical bay, holding his brother's hand, and whispered apologies in Old Norse for all the things he should have said before, all the times he'd been too proud or too blind or too busy being a hero to notice that his brother was breaking. In the quarantine zone, SHIELD scientists in containment suits were collecting samples of the alien biomass, storing it in cryo-containers, cataloging it, studying it. Dr. Chen stood in the middle of what used to be a Starbucks and was now a cavity of organic matter, and she took readings with equipment that was giving her numbers that didn't make sense. The biomass was dead, breaking down, but it was breaking down into compounds that Earth biology shouldn't be able to produce. Amino acids that didn't exist in nature. Proteins folded in configurations that defied known chemistry. This wasn't just alien. This was fundamentally different life, evolved along pathways that had nothing to do with Earth, nothing to do with DNA or carbon-based chemistry as humans understood it. She took more samples, made more notes, and deep in her gut she felt a cold certainty that humanity had just had its first contact with something vast and terrible, and this was only the beginnings. At SHIELD headquarters, Fury was in a secure conference room on a video call with the World Security Council, and they were arguing about what to do with the information, whether to go public or keep it classified, whether to increase military readiness or avoid causing panic. Fury let them argue. He'd already made his decision. Earth was vulnerable. Earth had no defense against threats like this, and Earth needed to get serious about preparing for what was out there, because the universe was bigger and darker and more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit, and pretending otherwise was just going to get people killed. He'd start with expanding SHIELD's xenobiology division, then weapons development, then recruitment of enhanced individuals who could fight things that conventional military couldn't handle. The Avengers had proven the concept. Now he needed to scale it, turn it into something permanent, something ready for the next crisis, because there would be a next crisis. There always was. In the ruins of Stark Tower, in the wreckage of the top floors, something moved. A small piece of biomass, overlooked by the cleanup crews, hidden in a crack in the foundation. It pulsed once, twice, and then went still, dormant, waiting because the hive was patient. The hive was everywhere, and the hive always found a way. 2 weeks after the battle, Manhattan was still under partial quarantine, but Life was returning to something like normal. The news had covered it as a terrorist attack using experimental biological weapons, which was true enough from a certain point of view. The Avengers were being called heroes, which made Steve uncomfortable because he'd just been doing his job, made Tony defensive because he knew how many things had gone wrong, made Bruce retreat further from public view because the last thing he needed was attention. Natasha and Clint went back to S.H.I.E.L.D. operations like nothing had happened, because that's what spies did. They compartmentalized. Thor prepared to return to Asgard with Loki, who had woken up 3 days ago but hadn't spoken a word since, just stared at the ceiling with eyes that saw things no one else could see. The psychological evaluations started on day 4. Mandatory for all Avengers, Fury's orders, and none of them were happy about it, but they all showed up because that was the deal. Steve talked about survivors' guilt and the weight of command and how it never got easier watching people die. Tony talked around his issues, deflected with humor, and the therapist noted probable PTSD and recommended follow-up that Tony would definitely not attend. Bruce talked about the Hulk and control and fear, and the therapist was quietly terrified the entire session but maintained professional composure. Natasha and Clint's sessions were classified even from Fury, because they'd seen and done things that required more than standard counseling. Thor didn't attend at all, claiming Asgardian mental fortitude, which everyone knew was garbage, but no one called him on it because you couldn't force a god into therapy. In a S.H.I.E.L.D. research lab 3 levels below ground, Dr. Chen was working on the Tyranid samples, and what she was finding kept her up at night. The biomass wasn't just adaptive, it was intelligent, in a way that made human intelligence look primitive. Every cell carried genetic information for thousands of possible forms, and the trigger mechanisms that activated different forms were responsive to environmental stimuli at a speed that made evolution look like standing still. This wasn't natural selection over generations, this was intentional design, guided mutation, biological engineering on a scale that suggested whoever or whatever created the Tyranids had been doing it for a very long time. She wrote reports, sent them up the chain, and waited for someone to take it seriously. Fury took it seriously. He assembled a task force, pulled in experts from a dozen fields, biologists and weapons developers and tactical analysts, and gave them one job: figure out how to kill these things if they ever came back. The task force worked around the clock. They tested every weapon in the S.H.I.E.L.D. arsenal against the preserved biomass samples. Conventional bullets barely slowed it down. Fire worked, but not well enough. Acid was hit or miss. Energy weapons showed promise, but required power outputs that weren't practical for infantry-scale deployment. Nuclear weapons would work, obviously, but using nukes on American soil was a political non-starter unless things got truly apocalyptic. The conclusion was clear. If the Tyranids came back in force, Earth was in serious trouble. 3 weeks after the battle, Steve was in a S.H.I.E.L.D. gym at 2 in the morning, working the heavy bag because he couldn't sleep, and exercise was better than staring at the ceiling. The bag was reinforced, designed for enhanced individuals, and he was hitting it hard enough to make the chain groan. He didn't hear Natasha come in until she spoke. "You're going to break that." He stopped, breathing hard. "Couldn't sleep," she nodded. "None of us can. It's normal." Steve looked at her. "Is it?" "Because I fought in a war, Natasha. I've seen terrible things. But those creatures, that hive thing, it was different. It wasn't evil, it wasn't cruel, it was just hungry. And somehow that's worse." Natasha leaned against the wall. "'Cause you can't negotiate with hunger, can't make a treaty, can't find common ground. You can only kill it or be killed by it. That's why it scares you, because all your principles, all your ideals about doing the right thing, they don't matter against something that just wants to eat you." Steve was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah, that's exactly it." Tony was in his workshop, not sleeping, because sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant reliving the moment when his suit failed, when he couldn't protect people, when he was helpless. Instead, he was designing new armor, better armor, armor that could handle biological threats, resist acid, fight for longer without power degradation. He had 17 different prototypes in various stages of development, and he was bouncing between them like a man possessed, because if he stopped working, if he stopped moving, the fear would catch up with him. Jarvis monitored his vital signs and said nothing, because Jarvis knew when to push and when to let Tony work through things in his own way. But the AI did quietly send a message to Pepper Potts, because someone needed to know that Tony was spiraling, and maybe she could help in ways that Jarvis couldn't. Bruce was in a SHIELD-provided apartment, meditating, trying to find center, trying to process what the Hulk had experienced. The Hulk had been hurt, really hurt. The acid had burned through his regeneration, left scars that had taken days to fully heal, and the Hulk remembered pain in a way that made Banner nervous. Because the Hulk learning caution was good, but the Hulk learning fear was dangerous. Fear could make the Hulk unpredictable. Fear could make him dangerous in new ways. Banner breathed slowly, focused on his heartbeat, and tried to reassure the other guy that they were safe, that the threat was gone, that everything was okay. The Hulk didn't believe him. Banner couldn't blame him. He didn't really believe it either. Thor sat with Loki in a secure holding cell that was as comfortable as S.H.I.E.L.D. could make it, which wasn't very. Loki had started talking again, but only to Thor, and only in fragments, broken sentences about vast darkness and endless hunger and voices in his head that wouldn't stop. The S.H.I.E.L.D. doctors said it was trauma, psychotic break, possibly permanent damage from the hive's neural connection. Thor thought it was punishment, cosmic justice for crimes committed, and he didn't know whether to feel satisfaction or grief. Mostly he felt tired. "Will you come home, brother?" Thor asked. Loki laughed, a broken sound. "Home, as if Asgard was ever home, as if anywhere could be home for a monster." Thor's jaw tightened. "You are not a monster. You are my brother. You made terrible choices, but you also saved this world in the end. That must count for something." Loki's eyes focused on him, really focused for the first time in days. "It counts for nothing, Thor. I opened the door. Everything that happened, all those people who died, that is on me, and the hive is still out there, in the dark between stars, and it knows about Earth now. It knows there is food here, and it will come back. Perhaps not today, perhaps not for years, but it will come back because that is what the hive does. It eats, and I showed it the way." At a S.H.I.E.L.D. black site in the Arctic, in a cryo-storage facility designed to contain biological hazards, a technician was doing routine checks on the Tyranid samples when he noticed something odd. One of the containers, the one holding what appeared to be a spore pod, was showing temperature fluctuations, tiny variations that shouldn't be possible in a cryo unit. He logged it, ran diagnostics. Everything checked out normal. He made a note in his report and moved on to the next container because he had 50 more to check and his shift ended in 3 hours. And he wanted to get home to his family. He didn't notice the microscopic crack forming in the container seal, didn't see the single dormant spore that escaped into the ventilation system, carried on air currents, settling into a dark corner where it would wait, patient and still, for the right conditions to wake up and begin growing again. The hive was patient, the hive was everywhere, and the hive had all the time in the universe. 6 months after Manhattan, S.H.I.E.L.D. detected an anomaly in northern Alaska. A research outpost studying Arctic permafrost had gone dark, missed 3 scheduled check-ins, and when a reconnaissance team flew overhead, the infrared showed something wrong. Massive heat signatures blooming across the tundra in patterns that didn't match any known geological or biological activity. Fury dispatched a rapid response team with orders to investigate and report back. They landed at 1400 hours local time. By 1430, they were screaming into their radios about creatures with too many legs emerging from the ground. By 1500, the screaming stopped. Fury listened to the last transmission, heard the sound of gunfire and tearing flesh and something that might have been a human voice begging for death, and he felt his blood turn cold because he recognized those sounds. He'd heard them in Manhattan. The Tyranids were back. The Avengers were recalled from their scattered locations, pulled back to S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters on emergency protocol, and when they assembled in the briefing room, they all saw it in Fury's face before he said a word. "Alaska," Fury said without preamble. "Research station went dark 6 hours ago. Response team went dark 3 hours ago. Satellite imagery shows organic growth spreading from the station site at approximately 200 meters per hour. It's them, the Tyranids. They're back. The room went silent. Then Steve spoke, voice tight. How? We closed the portal. We contained the biomass. We destroyed everything. Fury pulled up images on the screen. Satellite photos showing the tundra being consumed by sprawling organic matter. Structures that looked like the chitinous growths from Manhattan, but larger, more developed, more established. Best guess? Something survived. A spore, a dormant organism, something we missed. It's been growing underground for 6 months, feeding on whatever it could find, and now it's big enough to surface. He zoomed in on one particular structure, a towering spike of organic matter that pulsed with bioluminescent light. That's a hive spire. According to Dr. Chen's research, that's what happens when Tyranids establish a permanent foothold. They build spires to coordinate the swarm, process biomass, and spawn new creatures. If we don't stop this now, if it spreads beyond Alaska, we're looking at continental infestation within a year? Tony was already running calculations in his head. What's the temperature up there? Fury checked his notes. -20 Celsius, dropping to -40 at night. Tony nodded slowly. So they've adapted to cold. Great, fantastic, just fantastic, because the last batch wasn't nightmare-inducing enough. Bruce spoke up, quiet but firm. What's the containment plan? Are we evacuating the surrounding area? Fury's face was grim. The surrounding area is wilderness. Nearest town is 80 miles south, population 300. We're evacuating them now. But if this thing spreads to the forests, if it reaches a major population center, evacuation won't be enough. We'll need to sterilize the entire region. Steve understood immediately. You're talking about nuclear options. Fury met his eyes. I'm talking about survival, Captain. The World Security Council is already discussing authorization. We have maybe 48 hours before they push the button. So if we're going to handle this conventionally, we need to move now. Thor stood, face dark. I will not allow another world to fall to the great devourer. Asgard will assist. I can bring warriors, weapons forged in the heart of dying stars. Fury shook his head. No time. We move in 6 hours. Whatever we take from Earth's arsenal. Thor, you're welcome to come, but leave the alien cavalry at home. This is our mess. We clean it up. Natasha was studying the satellite images with the focused intensity of someone planning an infiltration. The hive spire, that's the priority target. We take that down, we disrupt their coordination, buy time to eliminate the rest. Clint nodded agreement. How do we take it down? That thing looks like it could survive a direct missile strike. Tony's eyes were distant, calculating. We don't hit it from outside, we go in, plant charges at the structural weak points, blow it from the inside. Steve looked at him. That's a suicide run. Tony's smile was sharp and didn't reach his eyes. Then it's a good thing I've got a suit designed for hostile environments. Who's coming with me? The mission prep took 4 hours. Tony upgraded his armor with cold-resistant materials and redundant power systems, learning from the failures in Manhattan. Bruce was given an experimental containment suit that could handle the Hulk's transformation without shredding. Because they'd need the big guy, and they couldn't risk him being vulnerable to the cold, Steve's shield was treated with an acid-resistant coating. Natasha and Clint loaded up with incendiary ammunition and thermal charges, weapons designed to burn hot enough to destroy biological matter at the cellular level. Thor needed no preparation beyond Mjolnir, but even he looked grim, because Asgard's legends about the Tyranids didn't end well. And legends existed for a reason. They boarded a shield transport at 2200 hours and flew north into darkness. The flight took 6 hours, and nobody slept. Steve sat quietly, mentally reviewing tactical scenarios. Tony ran system checks on his armor obsessively. Bruce meditated and tried to keep his heart rate steady. Natasha cleaned her weapons with mechanical precision. Clint stared out the window at the darkness below. Thor stood at the front of the cargo bay, gripping Mjolnir, and whispered old prayers in Old Norse, asking the All-Father for strength and the Norns for favorable fate. When they were 30 minutes out, Fury's voice came over the radio. Satellite shows the hive spire has grown 50 feet in the last 6 hours. Whatever you're going to do, do it fast. You've got until dawn. After that, the council launches. Steve's voice was steady. Understood. We'll get it done. They dropped at 5,000 feet, jumping from the transport into freezing darkness. and the cold hit like a physical blow. Tony and Thor could fly. The others had parachutes and thermal suits and prayers. They landed 2 miles from the hive spire in deep snow, and immediately the landscape felt wrong. The trees were dead, stripped of bark, their trunks covered in organic growth that pulsed with faint light. The ground was spongy underfoot, not snow anymore, but something else, something that felt alive. The smell was overwhelming even through filters, rot and acid, and that same wrong biological scent from Manhattan, but worse, concentrated, older. "Stay tight," Steve said. "Move fast. No unnecessary engagement. Our target is the spire." They moved through the corrupted forest in formation, weapons ready, and within 5 minutes they encountered the first creatures. These were different from Manhattan, larger, more heavily armored, adapted for Arctic conditions with thick chitinous plates and internal heat generation that made them glow faintly in infrared. They moved through the snow like it wasn't there, and when they detected the Avengers, they didn't charge blindly like before. They coordinated, flanked, used the terrain. Steve's shield took a hit from a bone spike, and the impact nearly broke his arm. Tony's repulsors burned through 1 creature's armor, but 3 more appeared immediately. Thor's lightning struck from above and killed 6 at once, but the bodies were already being dragged away by smaller organisms, being consumed, being recycled. "They're learning faster," Tony said, voice tight. "They're using pack tactics, military-grade tactics." Bruce led the Hulk out, and the transformation was faster now, more controlled, and Hulk immediately grabbed a tree-sized growth and used it as a club, smashing creatures left and right. But even Hulk was careful now, remembering the acid, remembering the pain. They fought their way toward the hive spire, and with every step the resistance increased. More creatures, bigger creatures, things that looked like they were grown specifically to counter the Avengers' abilities, like the hive had studied Manhattan and designed solutions. Creatures with reflective carapaces that deflected repulsor blasts, creatures with regenerative abilities that made them nearly impossible to kill, creatures that moved faster than human eyes could track. Natasha put a thermal charge into one and watched it burn from the inside out, but 2 more took its place immediately. Clint's arrows were running low, each shot counting, each shot a kill, but there were so many targets. "We're not going to make it at this rate," Clint said, voice steady but honest. Steve knew he was right. They were 200 meters from the spire and losing ground. They needed a new plan. "Thor, can you create a corridor, clear us a path?" Thor nodded, raised Mjolnir, and called down lightning like the wrath of gods. The sky opened, thunder rolling across the tundra, and bolts of electricity burned through the swarm in a continuous cascade of destruction. It worked. For 30 seconds, they had a clear path. "Move!" Steve shouted, and they ran, full sprint through smoking biomass and dying creatures, and they covered the 200 meters in under a minute. The hive spire loomed above them, 50 meters tall, pulsing with bioluminescent veins, and up close it was even more horrifying. A twisted cathedral of flesh and bone and chitin that seemed to breathe, that seemed to watch them with senses they couldn't understand. There was an opening at the base, a sphincter-like entrance that contracted and expanded rhythmically. "That's our way in," Tony said. Nobody argued. They entered. The interior of the spire was a nightmare rendered in biological architecture. Walls that pulsed like a heartbeat, floors slick with fluids, organic chambers connected by tube-like passages that contracted to move them along, like being swallowed by a massive throat. The temperature was warmer inside, body temperature, and the smell was concentrated to the point of being nauseating. They moved through chambers filled with eggs, thousands of them pulsing and ready to hatch. They moved past pools of digestive fluids processing biomass, turning matter into energy. They moved past what looked like neural centers, ganglia the size of cars, pulsing with electrical activity that Tony's sensors registered as coordinating the entire swarm. "There," Natasha pointed, at the center of the spire, suspended in organic webbing, was something that looked like a brain, massive and complex, surrounded by creatures that looked like guards or priests or both. "That's the synaptic nexus, the control center. We destroy that, the swarm loses coordination." Steve nodded. "Plant the charges. We've got 5 minutes before this place realizes we're a threat to its core." They moved fast, placing thermal charges at structural points Tony identified. locations where the spire's organic architecture was thinnest, where explosive force would propagate through the entire structure. The creatures guarding the Nexus finally noticed them when they were on the fourth charge, and all hell broke loose. These weren't drones. These were warrior organisms, purpose-built for close combat, and they hit hard and fast. Steve's shield rang like a bell as he blocked strikes that would have killed anyone without super soldier enhancements. Natasha's acrobatics were the only thing keeping her ahead of claws that moved too fast to see. Clint shot his last 3 arrows into the Nexus itself, and they punched through the outer membrane, and the Nexus screamed, an actual sound that wasn't sound but pressure in the air that made everyone's ears bleed. The entire spire convulsed. Thor grabbed the brain mass directly, lightning pouring from his hands, cooking it from the inside, and the creatures went insane, attacking everything, attacking each other, coordination broken. "Charges set!" Tony shouted. "We need to leave! Now!" They ran back the way they came, the spire collapsing around them, walls contracting, trying to trap them, trying to keep them inside. Hulk punched through blockages, making a path with brute force. Tony used repulsors to blast open passages that were closing. They burst out of the entrance just as the charges detonated, and the explosion was muffled and wet and wrong, and the entire spire collapsed inward like a deflating lung, organic matter liquefying, the bioluminescent light dying. Around them, across the corrupted landscape, the creatures stopped moving. Connection severed, hive coordination broken. They fell where they stood, bodies already beginning to break down without the Nexus to sustain them. The Avengers stood in the snow, breathing hard, covered in alien fluids, and watched the hive die. "Is it over?" Bruce asked, back to human form, shivering in the cold. Tony scanned the area with his sensors. "Biomass is breaking down. No active signatures. I think we got it." Steve didn't relax. "We thought we got it in Manhattan too. We need to burn everything. Leave nothing alive, nothing that could regenerate." The SHIELD cleanup crews arrived at dawn with flamethrowers and chemical dispersants and orbital surveillance to make sure nothing escaped. They burned for 3 days straight, turning 50 square miles of tundra into ash and scorched earth. They dug down 30 feet, burning layers of permafrost where spores might have burrowed. They tested every gram of soil, every drop of water, looking for contamination. Dr. Chen supervised personally because she understood the stakes better than anyone. One surviving spore, one dormant cell, and this would all happen again. On the 4th day, she declared the site clean. On the 5th day, Fury ordered them to burn it again anyway, just to be sure. On the 6th day, they finally stopped, and the site looked like a crater, like something had been torn from the earth and nothing would ever grow there again. Maybe that was better. Maybe scorched earth was the only answer to the hive. The Avengers returned to New York exhausted and traumatized in new ways because Alaska had been worse than Manhattan, more intimate, more desperate. They'd been inside the hive, literally inside its body. And that was something you couldn't forget, couldn't unsee. The debriefings were longer this time, more intense, because Fury needed to know everything, needed to understand how the infestation had started, and how to prevent it from happening again. The conclusion was simple and terrible. They'd never found all the biomass from Manhattan. Something had escaped containment. Something had survived, and if it happened twice, it could happen again. SHIELD instituted new protocols, mandatory genetic screening for all personnel who'd been near the New York site, quarantine procedures for any biological samples, fail-safes and redundancies, and paranoia turned into policy. It still might not be enough. 2 weeks after Alaska, Loki was extradited to Asgard for trial. Thor came to collect him personally, and the Bifrost opened in a SHIELD facility, rainbow light and cosmic power, and for a moment everyone in the building felt small and insignificant because they were reminded that Earth was not alone in the universe, was not special, was just one small world among billions. Loki walked into the light without resistance, hands bound, face expressionless. He stopped at the threshold and looked back at the Avengers, who had assembled to see him off. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice was quiet and honest, "for what I brought to your world, for the death, for the fear. I sought power and found only ruin. That is my curse, to destroy everything I touch. Thor put a hand on his shoulder, gripped firm but not cruel. You will face justice, brother, but you will also face mercy. Father has decreed it. You will live. That is more than many would grant you. Loki laughed, bitter. Life in chains is not mercy, Thor. It is simply a longer death. Then the light took them both, and they were gone, and Earth was alone again. The World Security Council convened 1 week later to discuss Earth's defense posture in light of the Tyranid incidents, and the debate was fierce. Some argued for increased military spending, development of new weapons, preparation for inevitable future attacks. Others argued for diplomatic outreach, trying to find allies among the stars, building coalitions. Still others argued for secrecy, keeping the public ignorant, maintaining the illusion of safety. Fury argued for all of it, because Earth needed every advantage it could get, but mostly he argued for the Avengers initiative to be expanded, formalized, given real authority and real resources. We got lucky twice, he told the council. Luck runs out. Next time something comes through a portal or falls from the sky or crawls up from underground, we need to be ready. And ready means more than 6 people with special abilities. Ready means infrastructure, training, coordination, a real defense. The council debated, they always debated, but in the end they authorized funding, because even politicians understood that ignoring existential threats was bad for re-election chances. 3 weeks after Alaska, Tony was in his workshop again, not sleeping again, because he'd realized something terrible. The Tyranids adapted, they learned, they evolved, which meant every fight taught them something new about humanity, about Earth, about how to kill more efficiently. Every battle was intelligence gathering for the Hive. Every victory was just teaching the enemy how to win next time. He sat in his chair, staring at holographic projections of Tyranid biology, and tried to find a weakness that wasn't just burn everything, because burning everything wasn't sustainable as a long-term strategy. There had to be something, some fundamental flaw in their design, some exploitable vulnerability. He worked for 16 hours straight before Pepper found him and dragged him to bed, and even then he dreamed of chitinous armor and acid blood and endless hunger. Steve was doing better, or at least pretending to be. He'd started teaching hand-to-hand combat classes at S.H.I.E.L.D., training the next generation of agents, passing on what he knew. It helped. Giving other people the tools to survive made the survivor's guilt more bearable. But at night, alone in his apartment, he'd stand at the window and look out at the rebuilt parts of Manhattan and think about how fragile civilization was, how close they'd come to losing everything. How many people depended on the Avengers being perfect every time, because one mistake could cost millions of lives. The pressure was enormous. He carried it because that's what soldiers did, but it was heavy, so heavy. Bruce had gone the other direction, retreating from S.H.I.E.L.D., from the Avengers, from everything. He'd found a small town in Montana and was working at a clinic under an assumed name, treating ordinary people with ordinary problems, trying to remember what normal felt like. The Hulk was quieter now, less angry, more cautious, and Bruce didn't know if that was growth or trauma, maybe both, maybe it didn't matter. He helped people, he stayed away from major cities, he checked in with Fury once a week to confirm he was still alive and stable. It was enough. It had to be enough. Natasha and Clint went back to operations, taking missions, doing the work that kept the world turning, but they were different now, more careful, more aware of how quickly things could go wrong. They'd seen the Hive up close, seen what happened when nature decided to wage war, and it had changed something fundamental in how they viewed threats. Nothing felt safe anymore. Every mission felt like it could be the one where something slipped through, where the world ended because they were looking in the wrong direction. They didn't talk about it. They just worked. Worked until they were too tired to think. That was coping. That was survival. 4 weeks after Alaska, Dr. Chen published a classified report that made its way to Fury's desk and kept him awake for 2 nights straight. The title was simple: On the Inevitable Return of the Tyranid Hive Fleet to Earth. The contents were less simple. She'd analyzed every piece of data they had, run projections, built models, and her conclusion was mathematically certain. The Hive knew about Earth now, knew it was rich in biomass, poorly defended, ideal for consumption, and somewhere out in the darkness between stars, the Hive fleet was moving. following the psychic echo of the spores that had landed here, drawn by the promise of food. It might take years, it might take decades, but it would come, and when it did, when the full force of a Tyranid hive fleet arrived at Earth, not just a scouting force or a spore accident, but a real fleet, with bioships the size of cities and synapse creatures that could coordinate billions of organisms, Earth would die. Not might die, would die. Unless humanity did something impossible in the time they had left, unless they became something more than they were, unless they evolved faster than the thing that existed to evolve. Fury read the report 3 times. Then he called a meeting with the Avengers, all of them, no exceptions. They assembled in a secure conference room, and Fury laid out the situation without sugarcoating anything. "We're in a race," he said. "The hive is coming, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 50, but it's coming. And when it arrives, we need to be ready to fight a war on a scale this planet has never seen. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to build weapons, build ships, build defenses. We're going to recruit every enhanced individual, every genius, every soldier willing to stand between Earth and oblivion. We're going to train, we're going to prepare, and when they come, we're going to be ready." He looked around the table at the faces of Earth's mightiest heroes. "I know you're tired. I know you've given everything, but I'm asking for more, because if we don't do this, if we give up now, then everyone who died in Manhattan and Alaska died for nothing. So what do you say? Are you with me?" Steve stood first, until the end of the line. Tony stood second, slower, but his voice was firm. "Someone's got to save the world. Might as well be us." Bruce stood, quiet but present. "I'm in." Natasha and Clint stood together. "Always." The chair where Thor would have sat was empty, but they all knew if they called, he would come. That was enough. Fury allowed himself the smallest smile. "Then let's get to work." The years that followed were hard. S.H.I.E.L.D. expanded into a global defense network. The Avengers grew from 6 to 12 to 20, recruiting enhanced individuals from across the world. Tony built a fleet of defensive satellites and AI-controlled combat drones. Bruce developed medical treatments for Tyranid contamination. Steve trained entire battalions in anti-swarm tactics. Natasha and Clint built intelligence networks to watch for any sign of hive activity. They built and prepared and waited, and with each passing year, the threat felt more distant, easier to ignore until it was just part of the background. The monster under the bed that might never come, but Fury never forgot. And Dr. Chen never stopped watching the stars, waiting for the shadow to return. On a rainy Tuesday in November, 5 years after Alaska, Fury was in his office doing paperwork. Because even saving the world required forms in triplicate when an alert flashed across his screen. Deep space telescopes had detected an anomaly, massive gravitational disturbances in the outer solar system. Objects moving at relativistic speeds too large and too numerous to be asteroids, and the computer was having trouble classifying them because they didn't match any known astronomical phenomena. Fury stared at the screen for 10 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and said 3 words. "They're here. Assemble." The S.H.I.E.L.D. cafeteria was serving meatloaf again, which Private Rodriguez thought was a crime against both food and humanity. It wasn't even good meatloaf. It was gray meatloaf, the kind that tasted like sadness and regret with a side of congealed gravy. He poked it with his fork and wondered if this was what he'd signed up for when he joined S.H.I.E.L.D., eating terrible food in underground bunkers while waiting for the apocalypse. Across the table, Private Kim was eating hers without complaint, which Rodriguez respected but also found mildly disturbing. "How can you eat that?" he asked. Kim shrugged. "It's food. I've had worse." Rodriguez couldn't imagine what could be worse than this meatloaf, but he didn't ask because he probably didn't want to know. Above them, alarms started blaring, red lights flashing, and the announcement came over the intercom. "All personnel to battle stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Rodriguez and Kim looked at each other, dropped their trays, and ran because the drills had been very clear about what happened if you didn't get to your station fast enough. Behind them, the meatloaf sat abandoned on the table, slowly congealing further. Because some things were constants even when the world was ending. Death, taxes, terrible S.H.I.E.L.D. cafeteria food.